A round clearing interrupted a forest canopy of bright oranges, dull browns, and pale greens. From this opening arose the bustle of a large group of people. One of them, a young woman, walked across the bare soil, dodging campfires, supplies, and running children. On her shoulder, several straight wooden poles, about twice her height, were balanced. Reaching the shade at the edge of this opening, she tipped one of these poles onto its end, lifted it with 2 hands, and let it fall heavily into one of several holes. As she continued her work, a man arrived with more posts, fashioned from the trunks of small oak and elm trees. Once assembled, they would form the frame of their tent, one of many here at the clan meeting. This woman's family was one of 15 that had gathered that fall. Usually scattered far and wide, they met at this clearing to renew their bonds of friendship. Surrounding them was a forest, which provided them richly with food, clothing, and materials for shelter. Scattered around the frame of the woman's shelter were baskets of mushrooms, horse chestnuts, butterburst stalks, and whole deer hides. Among the supplies also stood bows, arrows, and stone axes. The woman picked up a water skin to quench her thirst, and took a moment to watch the lively commotion. Around the edge of this opening in the forest, a ring of tents was being erected. Some families were finished, and were building fires and catching up with friends in the center of the circle. In the distance, the chop of axes signaled the work of other families. This woman and her people were experts at navigating through the woods, along networks of paths, many originally blazed by elephants. Yet, these people were only a few generations descended from skilled mariners, who had crossed ocean water to reach this forested island. Some clans on the coast still made boats and ventured off the coast, but to the group building their circular camp in this clearing, ocean voyages were a distant memory, known only in fireside stories about their ancestors. This woman lived in Japan 36,000 years ago. She formed part of the first human culture on Honshu, the largest island of this archipelago. Through social and technological innovations, this society quickly distinguished itself from those on the Asian mainland. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 31, Origin of the Late Paleolithic of East Asia. As Homo sapiens spread across Asia, the Gobi Desert of Mongolia became the boundary between 2 distinct cultural spheres. Last time, we saw that forager bands living north and west of the Gobi belonged to the initial Upper Paleolithic, a widespread and symbolically complex culture that lasted from 50,000 to 35,000 years ago. Today, we'll explore the societies of this period in East Asia, south and east of the Gobi, where traditions were shaped by a different heritage. This region, covering northern China, Korea, and Japan, was dominated by a techno-complex that shared a fundamental approach to knapping stone tools, based on making flakes instead of blades. Yet, interestingly, as bands of Homo sapiens spread across East Asia, they quickly developed noticeable regional distinctions, quite different from the uniformity of the initial Upper Paleolithic in southern Siberia and Mongolia. Therefore, the societies of the Yellow River Basin, Manchuria, Korea, and Japan each formed distinct cultures around 40,000 years ago, a date which marks the beginning of a period known in this region as the Late Paleolithic. Before the arrival of Homo sapiens, other hominins lived in China and Korea. Many fossils and stone tools show that Homo erectus, possibly the first hominin to leave Africa, lived in China for hundreds of thousands of years, then went extinct about 150,000 years ago. Denisovans may have replaced Homo erectus in East Asia, although we only have fossil evidence of their presence on the Tibetan plateau of western China and in Siberia. The identity of the makers of stone tools in China between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago remains a mystery, heavily debated by paleoanthropologists. The oldest widely accepted Homo sapiens fossil in East Asia is 40,000 years old and was found at Tianwan Cave near Beijing in northern China. Nearby, another cave called Zhoukoudian revealed similar fossils dated to 38,000 years ago. Further north, slightly younger bones belonging to members of our species have been discovered, one in Mongolia and another in the Manchurian region of northeast China, both around 34,000 years old. Complete DNA sequences have been extracted from all of these ancient skeletons, except for those from Zhoukoudian. These genomes show that people living more than 1,000 kilometers apart from each other were closely related. Geneticists call this widespread ancient East Asian population the Tianwan lineage. The Tianwan population was more closely related to people living today in East Asia than any other modern group, showing that to some extent there has been genetic continuity in this part of the continent for tens of thousands of years. Furthermore, and even more important for understanding the colonization of Asia, Tianwan ancestry shares more genetic similarities with living Papuans and Aboriginal Australians than with ancient Europeans or Siberians. This means that the people that reached North China separated from ancestors of Europeans before separating from ancestors of Sahulians. Importantly, this finding supports the idea that the Tianwan population reached China by following a route south of the Himalayas. The final leg of this dispersal brought bands of Homo sapiens from Southeast Asia northward through China. This poorly understood chapter in the history of our species involved a significant change in latitude. As a result, multiple generations of Homo sapiens had to adapt to dramatically different biomes as they moved from tropical to subtropical and temperate forests, and eventually reached the dry, cold mammoth steppe that stretched into northern China and Japan during the last ice age. The nature of this dispersal was quite different from that north of the Himalayas, where once in temperate latitudes, people of the initial Upper Paleolithic traversed eastward through a similar ecosystem. As a result, the technology of this Siberian culture could be successfully applied over a wide geographic range at the southern edge of the Asian steppe. On the other hand, the environmental gradient in East Asia contributed to the creation of latitudinal thresholds, which separated distinct techno-complexes during the late Paleolithic. For example, 30 degrees north latitude marked the boundary between the techno-complexes of North and South China, which were characterized by different types of stone tools both before and after the arrival of Homo sapiens. Specifically, in South China, stone tools tended to be heavier and made from cobblestones gathered from riverbanks. These large-scale distinctions in approaches toward toolmaking point toward fundamentally different ways of exploiting resources, different strategies shaped by the limitations and opportunities imposed by different environments. As our species spread across East Asia, they founded multiple genetic populations. One of these was the Tianhuan population of northern China and Mongolia. Evidence for other founding groups that inhabited other parts of East Asia comes from DNA extracted from the bones of people descended from those ancient lineages who lived during the past 12,000 years. For example, the genome of an 8,000-year-old person from Laos carried ancestry from groups that split from the Tianhuan lineage during the initial dispersals into Southeast Asia. Evidence from other early populations have been found in southern China, Tibet, Taiwan, and Japan. Those in Taiwan and Japan are related to each other, raising the possibility of an early branch of people who dispersed along the coast. A complex and mysterious story of exploration, settling, and further expansion is only starting to be revealed through genetic analysis. As we turn now to the archaeological record, we will find further confirmation that the spread of our species in East Asia led quickly to the formation of distinctive peoples, characterized not only by unique genetic mutations, but also by separate cultural practices. At some time around 40,000 years ago or earlier, bands of Homo sapiens crossed the Yellow River and made their way into the mix of open steppe and coniferous forest that covered northern China. However, it's difficult to distinguish the ancient camps of those incoming migrants from the preceding hominin occupants of this land. Both groups used remarkably similar stone tools. This makes northern China quite different from Europe and Siberia, where significant technological changes heralded the arrival of our species. Early Homo sapiens settlers and other hominins employed simple stoneworking techniques. They rarely prepared the core stone and exercised little control over the shape of the flakes that were released. People used some of these amorphous flakes without modifications, whereas others were made into scrapers and points. Two other common tool types produced by North Chinese foragers are called notches and denticulates by archaeologists. In the former, a large notch was created in the edge of a flake. It's thought that this indentation served to scrape the bark off small branches and straighten them to become the shafts of projectile weapons or other tools. Denticulates, on the other hand, bore a series of tiny pointy teeth along the edge of a flake, and might have been cutting or sawing tools. Importantly, hominins in northern China rarely made long, standardized blades, like those preferred by the people of the initial Upper Paleolithic. This fundamental characteristic differentiates the techno-complexes on either side of the Gobi Desert around 40,000 years ago. While scrapers, points, notches, and denticulates were made on small flakes, often around 5 centimeters wide, other heavier types of tools, including choppers, were made from thicker core stones. Like small flake tools, core tools lacked standardized shapes. Archaeologists refer to this simple approach to stone knapping as the core and flake tool techno-complex, and remarkably, it was practiced in northern China for hundreds of thousands of years without major changes. The simplicity of this approach to making stone tools resembles that of Sahulians and Southeast Asians during the Pleistocene. Core and flake tools persisted despite the invention of prepared cores by Neanderthals in Western Eurasia more than 200,000 years ago. This innovation never became a common practice in East Asia. It's even more surprising that Homo sapiens continued the core and flake tradition when they arrived. Were these basic knapping methods adopted from local Denisovans as our species migrated through Asia? We don't know. The core and flake techno-complex in northern China is a prehistoric conundrum, especially considering that the environment of northern China was not dramatically different from that of southern Siberia or Europe. Much of northern China at the time was a wide open steppe with small patches of pine trees. The first Homo sapiens to arrive hunted grassland herbivores, including horse, gazelle, deer, woolly rhinoceros, and aurochs. As we've learned before, simple stone tool production might reflect a greater reliance on organic materials, like wood, to make tools. In addition, this approach allows greater flexibility. Tools can be made quickly using easily accessible local rock types by people with a wide range of stone working experience and skill. So maybe the answer to this mystery is that versatility and dependence on organic materials became deeply ingrained within early Chinese cultures, including those of Homo sapiens. Finally, amorphous flakes often sufficed for collecting and processing plant foods. There's evidence from 2 late Paleolithic sites that people foraged for a wide variety of plants on the North Chinese steppe. Starch grains found on flakes and grinding stones have been identified as belonging to multiple grass species, legumes, nuts, and several tubers, including yams, snake gourd root, cattails, and lilies. Surprisingly, grass starch grains were the most common at both sites. People had collected and ground small wild grass seeds, a labor-intensive process, as far back as 33,000 years ago. If plant foods composed a major proportion of the diet of early societies in North China, this may also explain the predominance of flake tools. So at this point, it's worth coming back to a basic question. Are we sure that Homo sapiens actually used core and flake tools in North China? This techno-complex remained dominant within the Yellow River Basin and in Manchuria up until the start of the last glacial maximum, around 26,000 years ago. Couldn't the persistence of these tools after 40,000 years ago just reflect the survival of Denisovans? The short answer is we can't yet be entirely sure, but several pieces of information point toward the idea that Homo sapiens did use these simple tools in northern China. First, as I already mentioned, fossil discoveries show that Homo sapiens lived in northern China between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, when core and flake tools remained common. Even more important, one of the fossil-bearing archaeological sites, Zhoukoudian Cave, also contained simple flake tools alongside the bones of Homo sapiens. This direct association at Zhoukoudian, dated to 38,000 years ago, is strong evidence that the first forager bands of our species to live in East Asia used simple flake tools, like those of Denisovans and Homo erectus. If correct, This conclusion demonstrates the similarities between us and our evolutionary cousins on the one hand, and on the other shows that among the advantages that allowed our species to outcompete Denisovans, innovative stone tools were not always one of them. Despite the consistency of core and flake tools, the archaeological record of East Asia around 40,000 years ago does bear evidence of a shift in local cultures, consistent with the arrival of Homo sapiens. Some of the most obvious ones come from Korea and Japan. But first, we will look at the more subtle signs from northern China. Recently, archaeologists have taken a closer look at the core and flake tools dating between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago. At some sites, the frequency with which flakes were carefully shaped into tools, including finely retouched scrapers and points, increased during this period. At these same sites, transportation of high-quality stone, more than a day's walk from where it was gathered, became more common. Importantly, these trends were not ubiquitous in northern China, and those more advanced tools did not attain the level of standardization seen in other regions of Eurasia at the time, and were still strongly rooted in the core and flake tradition. If these limited changes in stone knapping represent the arrival of Homo sapiens, they can't be seen as reliable indicators. Instead, archaeologists mark the start of the late Paleolithic by an increase in the use of bone tools and symbolic items, both of which appear at a small number of sites starting around 40,000 years ago. Most of the bone tools from this period were shaped by striking them to remove flakes, much like the process of knapping stone. This technique resulted in crude bone scrapers, knives, and points. Other more carefully produced bone tools made by carving, scraping, and polishing also appeared, but in even smaller numbers. One in particular demonstrated exceptional craftsmanship. At a site known as Xiaogushan in northeast China, a 30,000-year-old harpoon was discovered with several barbs carved on opposite sides. This barbed bone point is older than those of the Magdalenian in Europe, suggesting an earlier invention of this technology in East Asia. However, we don't know how widespread this type of weapon became, since only one other example from this period has been discovered in East Asia, and that was in southern China. Another unique discovery reveals a different use of animal bone. Dated to 40,000 years ago, a sharp stone flake was found, still attached to the remnants of a bone handle. We often think of wood as the ideal material from which to make handles for tools. However, we know of several prehistoric and recent cases in which bone was used for this purpose, and this evidence from China merely reveals the antiquity of this practice. Several tools from this site also bear the imprints of plant fiber string, left in the residue of adhesive, both used to hold the stone and bone together. The final type of bone tool from the late Paleolithic in northern China appeared around 30,000 years ago. Bone needles with tiny eyes drilled at one end have been found at 4 sites, separated by hundreds of kilometers. At these sites, this tiny piece of sewing equipment, about 8 centimeters long and 4 millimeters thick, had been incorporated into the toolkit of people making core and flake tools. It seems that needles were an innovation that came several thousand years after the start of the late Paleolithic, well after the first Homo sapiens had arrived in North China. This technology may have spread into China from Siberia and Mongolia, where needles had been used since 45,000 years ago. Needles, along with bone handles, polished bone points, and harpoons, probably represent technological innovations of early Chinese cultures. A similar pattern occurs with evidence of symbolic behavior, including the use of ornaments, which first appear in northern China around 40,000 years ago. Like bone tools, ornaments did not become extremely common. For context, only about 1 in every 100 late Paleolithic archaeological sites have yielded ornaments, whereas about 1 in every 5 initial Upper Paleolithic sites in northern Asia have yielded jewelry. Despite its rarity, early symbolic activity in northern China reveals the emergence of regional cultural variation. For example, at 2 sites on the semi-arid steppe of inland China, people carved dozens of tiny circular beads from ostrich eggshell and painted them red, beginning around 33,000 years ago. Groups living in this dry inland region also used clam shells to craft jewelry. On the other hand, further east, animal teeth and stone were used to make ornaments. Experts have proposed that this difference in materials reflects an early cultural divide between the more humid eastern lowlands and the more arid western plateau. For example, at Zhoukoudian Cave, which falls within the eastern region, burials of 3 Homo sapiens were accompanied by a rich assortment of ornaments about 38,000 years ago. Along with red ochre powder spread over their bodies, 125 animal teeth littered the area around the skeletons, with several arranged on one of the skulls, likely from a head decoration. Some of the tooth beads show signs of having been sewn into clothing. In addition, 7 stone and 4 bone pendants had been left with the deceased. Interestingly, the people buried at Zhoukoudian had a clear preference for teeth belonging to badgers, foxes, and deer. Even though the teeth of wolf, bear, hyena, horse, and bison were also found in this cave, they had not been turned into ornaments. It seems that the early North Chinese culture of the humid lowland may have developed a symbolic connection to specific animals. Finally, at a fascinating site known as Zhaozhuang, people living 40,000 years ago built a shrine-like structure overlooking a river by piling up red blocks of sandstone which they carried from 5 kilometers away. On top, they placed the skull and tusks of an elephant. Building so-called shrines using the bones of animals was not an unprecedented practice during the Paleolithic. Magdalenians built similar altars in European caves. It's conceivable that these shrines were places for people with animistic beliefs to leave offerings to natural spirits they considered powerful. The construction at Zhaozhuang clearly indicates that early Chinese culture was shaped by symbolic beliefs and behaviors that included a special role for elephants. As bands of Homo sapiens spread into northern China, they likely also reached the Korean peninsula. At the time of this dispersal, the body of water that today lies between Korea and mainland China, the Yellow Sea, was mostly dry land due to low sea levels. In place of the Yellow Sea, a large plain connected a much wider Korean peninsula to the mainland. This plain was an extension of an enormous lowland that stretched along the entire Chinese coast, which in some places reached 300 kilometers further into the ocean than it does today. The first Homo sapiens to enter Korea probably used core and flake tools, like those in northern China. Yet, around 43,000 years ago, a distinctive addition to stone toolkits appeared among Korean hunter-gatherers. They learned how to make stone blades and transform them into tanged spear points. These stemmed points could be as long as 15 centimeters. Many were retouched along the edges to form rows of small sharp teeth, similar to the denticulated edges of flake tools in China. A study of 95 tanged points discovered at a single Korean site showed that many bore impact fractures, suggesting that their primary use was at the tip of projectile weapons. Too large to be arrowheads, they likely armed spears used to kill the main target of early Korean hunters, the forest-dwelling roe deer. This innovation became widespread on the Korean peninsula and came to define the late Paleolithic cultures of this region. The emergence of such a distinctive weapon suggests that the early societies of Korea evolved somewhat independently from those of China, where tanged points were extremely rare. The presence of blades in Korea 43,000 years ago raises interesting questions. We generally associate stone blade technology with our species, bringing up the possibility that the appearance of blades in Korea marks the arrival of Homo sapiens. Notably, the methods used by early Korean stoneworkers to produce blades were not sophisticated, not the efficient prismatic techniques that emerged in northern Asia during the initial Upper Paleolithic. Nor were these techniques those of the Levallois, another defining feature of groups north of the Gobi Desert at this time. Furthermore, blade knapping did not replace the core and flake techniques, and in fact only represented a small component of toolkits on the peninsula between 43,000 and 30,000 years ago. These observations are key to our interpretation of the first Korean blades and tanged points. Some archaeologists believe that the use of blade technology in Korea was the result of contact with groups of the initial Upper Paleolithic culture, migrating eastward from Mongolia. For example, we saw that these groups appeared at Shui-Dongguo, China, on the Yellow River by 40,000 years ago. Furthermore, a recent discovery revealed that around 45,000 years ago, people made blades and tanged points at another site in northern China, even closer to Korea. However, if bands of hunter-gatherers moved from Mongolia through northern China and spread their blade-making ways to the foragers of Korea, this cultural exchange was limited. The oldest Korean blades were made by people without knowledge of the techniques of the initial Upper Paleolithic. Therefore, other archaeologists prefer a different scenario, one in which local bands of people in Korea invented methods for producing blades and tanged points themselves. So, the mysterious beginning of the late Paleolithic in Korea could represent another independent invention of blade technology during the colonization of a new region by Homo sapiens. Alternatively, the origin of the late Paleolithic could represent a fusion of traditions originating in different regions of Asia, core and flake tools from the south and blades from the northwest. Either way, the use of blades and tanged points would distinguish the late Paleolithic cultures of Korea from those of neighboring China for at least 20,000 years, an extremely long-term cultural distinction. a unique Korean identity which emerged in the earliest stages of prehistory. As we now start exploring the prehistory of Japan, it's worth keeping a few things in mind. Japanese archaeology is extremely prolific. 10,000 late Paleolithic sites have been discovered. As a result, a great deal is known about the cultural variation over time and between the regions of Japan. However, while stone tool technology is well understood in Japan, a major piece of the archaeological puzzle is missing from this archipelago. Due to the frequency of volcanic eruptions and deposition of ash, Japanese soils are especially acidic. This acidity accelerates the decomposition of organic materials, including bone, meaning that human fossils are much rarer than in other parts of Asia, the oldest being only 17,000 years old. Furthermore, this limits our knowledge of the animals these early Japanese hunted, and of how they used materials like bone and shell. Paleolithic ornaments are essentially unknown. About 5,000 years after blades appeared in Korea, bands of people entered the Japanese islands for the first time. Most of these islands remained separated by water from continental Asia, even during the last glacial maximum, when the world's oceans were 120 meters below their current level. The consensus among archaeologists is that no hominins ever crossed the sea to settle the Japanese islands until Homo sapiens arrived around 38,000 years ago. At this time, 3 of the major Japanese islands, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, were joined together in a single large island called Paleo-Honshu. The 4th of the large Japanese islands, Hokkaido, was connected to the Asian mainland via an extremely narrow land bridge at the far northern end of this chain of islands. People would not reach Hokkaido until around 30,000 years ago, and when they did, they arrived by boat from the south via Paleo-Honshu, not by the northern land bridge. Groups of foragers first entered Japan at the southern end of Paleo-Honshu by crossing about 80 kilometers of ocean from the southern end of Korea. Another instance of an intentional dispersal over water in the process of Homo sapiens' expansion across the world. Interestingly, the colonization of Japan took place at least 12,000 years after the crossing of humans across the ocean between Wallacea and Sahul. So why did it take so much longer for our species to reach Japan than Sahul? Just in terms of distances, the likely dispersal route from Africa to Japan is shorter than from Africa to Sahul. Furthermore, the ocean crossing to Japan was shorter than that to Sahul. Possibly, the expansion into a colder, temperate climate presented more of an obstacle than traveling through the tropics. The delay may have taken place as groups of hunter-gatherers developed ways to cope with cold winters before they could successfully move into northern China and Korea from Southeast Asia. The crossing from Korea to Japan wasn't a fluke, but a planned movement of people who were experienced maritime navigators. Other small islands surrounding Japan were visited almost immediately after the crossing from Korea. For example, around 38,000 years ago, people traveled 30 kilometers into the Pacific Ocean from the eastern coast of Paleo-Honshu, collected obsidian from a small island called Kosushima, and returned to the mainland, where archaeologists discovered their obsidian tools discarded at several camps. Clearly, boat making and sea travel were common practices among the earliest settlers of Japan. A fascinating event further exemplifies the daring of the first East Asian mariners: the colonization of the Ryukyu archipelago, a chain of small islands stretching 1,000 kilometers between Paleo-Honshu and Taiwan. By 36,000 years ago, humans had reached the central Ryukyu Islands, far from any large landmass, and by 30,000 years ago, all of these islands were inhabited. This feat of maritime exploration exceeds in scope both the ocean crossings to Paleo-Honshu and to Sahul. At some points, the destination islands were not visible from the points of departure, exceeding 120 kilometers in at least one crossing. Reaching islands beyond the horizon demonstrates confidence in one's ability to venture out into the open ocean and contend with the currents. It's not clear if the colonists of the Ryukyu archipelago came from Paleo-Honshu in the north or from Taiwan in the south, which at the time was part of the Asian mainland. Interestingly, these settlers had a rapid impact on the small island ecosystems they encountered. 2 species of deer and 1 tortoise went extinct on this archipelago around 30,000 years ago. On these islands, including Okinawa, organic material remained preserved better than on the large islands of Japan, and 5 sites bearing fossils of these first inhabitants have been discovered, which show that they were in fact Homo sapiens. Archaeologists haven't found many remains left by this society of island hoppers, but what we do know reveals a fascinatingly unique culture. Their stone tools were generic flakes and heavy-duty choppers. But in addition, the people living on the Ryukyus used seashells in diverse applications, including to make scrapers, fishhooks, and beads. 2 fishhooks found in Okinawa are 22,000 years old, about the same age as similar artifacts recently discovered on Wallacean Islands, currently the oldest known cases of this technology. A fascinating parallel between early human societies that developed specific adaptations to life at the margin of the Pacific Ocean. Among bands of foragers that spread across the interior of Paleo-Honshu, a strikingly unique culture developed. If early Korean culture was unique, the first settlers of the main Japanese island created an even more distinctive society from those on the mainland. The stone tools carried by the first people in Japan consisted mostly of flakes, often with denticulated edges, falling within the core and flake techno-complex. However, from this foundation, various distinguishing practices emerged. One of these was the occasional use of blades, a custom that probably came with migrants from Korea. Like those of Korea, Japanese blades were rare and made with simple, unsophisticated methods. But unlike Korean blades, they were not converted into tanged points. Instead, hunters in Japan made a similar form of pointed blade with a carefully shaped base, but not a prominent stem. This shows how a hunting weapon imported by migrants quickly evolved into a new regional style. Interestingly, as the first bands of foragers spread through Paleo-Honshu, pointed blades were only used by people living on the northwest side of the central mountain range. This geographic pattern may reflect a regional difference in lifeways. In the colder, drier, pine, spruce, and hemlock forests of the mountains, long stone spear points may have been more valuable than in the temperate oak, elm, and beech forests of the south. Plant foods would have been more abundant in the south, and hunting tactics may have differed from one forest type to another. A much more widespread and uniquely Japanese invention was a smaller type of stone point. Known to archaeologists as trapezoids, even though some are shaped more like triangles, they were only about 3 centimeters long. Given the presence of impact fractures from high-speed collisions and the small size of these trapezoids, it's been proposed that they were used at the tips of arrows. If correct, the first inhabitants of Japan were prolific bow hunters, which they likely used to hunt sika deer. Alongside pointed blades and trapezoids, another innovative stone technology of this incipient Japanese culture was ground-edge stone axes. Ranging from 5 to 20 centimeters long, these heavy-duty tools were carefully shaped and sharpened by grinding one edge on a large whetstone, which have also been discovered, bearing the deep indentations from being used to sharpen axes. As with trapezoids, axes were a ubiquitous tool among the first bands of Japanese hunter-gatherers. Over 800 ground-edge axes have been discovered at 200 sites in Paleo-Honshu, dating between 38,000 and 30,000 years old. Damage on sharpened edges suggests that the largest axes were used to chop wood, and when they broke, they were recycled and reworked to make smaller tools for scraping animal hides. Creating a ground-edge stone tool requires hours of hard work, but the result is a sharpened edge much more resistant to chopping than one made by knapping. When humans first reached Japan, Paleo-Honshu was heavily forested. Given the prominence of axes in the forager culture that emerged, the people of this society must have exploited the wood from these forests extensively. There are a few theories as to why they chopped so much wood. First is the idea that ground-edge axes were originally invented to build boats, perhaps dugout canoes. This hypothesis is based on another parallel between Japan and Seoul, where wasted and edge-ground axes were also invented soon after the arrival of Homo sapiens. Ground-edge stone tools were rare in the world at this time, so it's striking that they appeared in 2 places settled by major ocean-going voyages. Some experts believe this to be a case of cultural convergence, where the same solution to a technical problem emerged independently. However, following the colonization of Japan and Seoul, axes must have been applied to other woodworking purposes, because many of them are found far away from navigable water. Therefore, a second theory has been proposed to explain the importance of axes in Japan more than 30,000 years ago. Here, axes may have been used to chop down trees to clear space in the forest for camps. The discovery of dozens of large campsites, probably used during special gatherings of multiple forager bands, supports this hypothesis. On average, these aggregation camps were about 20 meters in diameter, but some reached 80 meters wide. Besides clearing the space, Axes may have also served to prepare wooden poles with which to pitch tents. Interestingly, the layout of these camps reveals the presence of strong social norms within early Japanese culture. Based on the scatter of stone tools, archaeologists are able to map out the likely placement of individual tents, and when they do, they find a strikingly uniform circular arrangement at all of these sites. Rings of tents around an open central space, hosting between 50 and 100 people, are considered a defining trait of the first Japanese culture. 146 circular camps have been discovered so far. The remains found at circular camps are not especially dense, suggesting that they were only used for short, special gatherings, probably to reinforce social ties. This original Japanese society, composed of axe-wielding bow hunters that made circular camps, would eventually be replaced by a different set of customs. Arrows armed with trapezoid-shaped stone points would become much less common on this island after 32,000 years ago. At the same time, the practice of making stone axes and circular camps slowly faded away. In place of trapezoids, new types of stone points made on blades grew in popularity. The original culture of Japan had lasted for 6,000 years. The cause of its disappearance is unclear. However, the abandonment of such widespread and distinctive practices marks a significant event, a transition to a new form of hunter-gatherer society. The beginning of the late Paleolithic marks the arrival of our species in East Asia, probably sometime between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. Although, as we have seen, identifying this event in the archaeological record is not always straightforward. In the past, it was common for archaeologists to propose that the presence of stone blades, bone tools, and ornaments, the hallmarks of the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, mark the arrival of Homo sapiens around the world. However, in East Asia, this is only true to a certain extent, where core and flake tools remained the basis of stone technology after the beginning of the late Paleolithic. Furthermore, bone tools and ornaments also serve as ambiguous markers of Homo sapiens dispersals in this part of the world. Instead, other innovations mark the arrival of our species, including tanged points, trapezoid arrowheads, ground-edge axes, and maritime travel. The success of our species was not limited to a single package of new behaviors. In our next episode, we will learn about the first set of major cultural changes to transform the late Paleolithic societies of Northeast Asia. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.